I really want to impact the people that feel a little bit stuck. Maybe it's something physical, maybe it's mental, maybe it's emotional, maybe they're not even quite sure, but they know that perhaps they're not meeting their full potential, that there's a bit of a blockage, because that really, to me, is like what breath work has done for me. It's like blown the lid off all of that stuff, and it like really helps you identify where are the things that are perhaps in your way. So the people that perhaps aren't meeting their full potential, maybe it is dysfunction or illness, maybe it's just knowing that they're not really at their 100%, and they want to take those steps. They're proactive, they're motivated, they know that there's a better them that's out there. They just perhaps haven't found that yet. And working with those people, I think it gives me a lot of motivation, because you get to see this little light bulb go off and like, oh, this is how I can live my life. I feel better, and that helps me treat the people around me better. It's like this ripple effect of when you feel good every day, like you make the other people around you feel good, and vice versa. If you feel down in the dumps, like people notice that, like, and it affects those. So like optimizing your own present day experience is the best thing you can do for the people around you, and using these tools just to sort of understand a little bit more and work towards that 100% you.
You're listening to the Live Life Longer show with Dan Voss, inspiring people to live longer through natural practices like cold exposure, sauna use, breath work, intermittent fasting, and the healing powers of nature. In this week's episode, my guest is Campbell Will, a senior physiotherapist and certified Wim Hof Method Instructor. He's combined his passion for breathwork and knowledge of anatomy and physiology, and has developed an education system to teach people how to optimize their respiration and how to use it as a tool for improved health and well-being. His own journey has been one of passionate curiosity, exploring the wide range of breathwork practices and the underpinnings of human optimization. He teaches not only the principles of breath, but also the foundations of health and performance. He believes that to breathe, move, and feel 100% is achievable by all. Campbell, welcome to the Live Life Longer show.
Dan, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, man, I'm excited for this conversation. I'm trying to remember how we connected. It might have been through Instagram, through our shared interest of breath work and Wim Hof Method, but I'm glad we connected and we're together today for this recording. I know a big part of what you do in your work is around breath work, so I think we'll definitely get into that pretty extensively in our conversation. But you're also a certified Wim Hof Method Instructor, so I would like to start with the Wim Hof piece. Maybe you can share with us how you got started with it and how you got into practicing it to begin with, and then also the interest of becoming a certified instructor.
Yeah, definitely. I often say the Wim Hof method's the thing that sort of kicked open the door for me. Like it wasn't a gentle introduction. The Wim Hof just like blew the door off the hinges, and I was like, whoa, this is some pretty interesting stuff. And so at the time I was actually working as a respiratory physical therapist in ICUs and respiratory wards, where my job was really to go in and breathe for people, like the people on ventilators, getting people up out of bed and mobilizing, just the very, very low grade function that those people could achieve. And I sort of noticed this disconnect, or this difference in what I was expected to do in a hospital setting and what I was allowed to do versus what I discovered the potential of things like breath work and the Wim Hof method were. So that really, as I mentioned, sort of kicked open the doors, because I sort of stumbled across the Wim Hof method. I watched the Vice documentary and I was like, whoa, this guy's doing some pretty crazy stuff. Mm-hmm. And like most things in my life, I was like, I'm going to dive headfirst into it. And all of the benefits that they sort of touted, like I saw, like I lost weight, my energy got better, my sleep improved, my energy, like I really just noticed all of the things started to happen. So I was like, there's something to this. I'm quite objective minded as a physio, so I really wanted to look at the physiology and the anatomy and like, why does this stuff work? And so that really just put me on. I often say it's the best rabbit hole I've ever gone down, because I'm still going down the rabbit hole, like working out this interaction of breath and energy and emotion and psychology. So that was the sort of introduction to this realm, outside of, say, my therapeutic practice as a physio, to all of the other like Eastern principles and the yogic traditions that have worked with the breath for thousands of years. I think it's really interesting. There's this sort of modern resurgence of interest in something
Sure.
that's not new at all. It's very old, but now we can sort of package it and look at it through that scientific lens of like, oh, this is what happens to the body, and this is why we get the effects we get. And I think a lot of people need that. Like I personally, before I really dived into the science behind this, it was more of a principle or an idea. It's like, oh yeah, I could see how that might affect. But once I could actually dive in and be like, oh, this is what's happening at the physiological level, at the cellular level, like, of course, this is what the result would be. And that really helped me sort of put my passion behind it, because I then understood a little bit more of the principles at play. So I'm really grateful for Wim and sort of putting himself at the expense of science and being like, study me, like work out what I can do. Because you talk to him and it was a long, arduous journey where he was sort of the circus freak of like, let's make him do these crazy stunts, rather than like, what is the benefit that we can provide to people from what this guy's discovered or rediscovered. So I think it's been a really, really interesting and dynamic journey, with the Wim Hof method being that sort of that first foray into this realm of breathwork and cold exposure and using the elements and using nature to optimize our experience.
Hey guys, I want to take a quick second to tell you about Blossom Wellness, a mental health hygiene company that gives people the tools they need to better manage feelings of stress, anxiety, and mental burnout. Their signature product, Bliss Blend, is formulated with lion's mane, reishi mushroom, and full spectrum CBD oil to aid in reducing feelings of stress and anxiety, boosting immunity, and supporting brain health. This is my personal favorite CBD product, as it provides a nice blend of calmness along with focus and mental clarity throughout the day. To try Blossom, go to blossomwellness.co and use the code DANVOSS, that's DANVOSS, at checkout for 10% off all orders. Yeah, 100%. I'm really it's fresh on my mind right now, just because I this past weekend attended a workshop here in Chicago, and I've been practicing the method for about a year, just pretty much on my own on a daily basis with the breath work and cold showers. So I'm seeing some of those same benefits that you talked about, in terms of more energy, better sleep, improved mood. And when I go to a workshop, it seems like all those benefits are just amplified. Like doing it on my own is one thing, but when you go to a workshop and you're in that group setting and you have, especially with the breathwork piece, you have an instructor that is there to guide you through it, and you can just like let go entirely, right? Like if you do it on the app on your own in my bedroom, on my bed, just laying down, sure, it's good, and that's one thing, because you're focused on the phone, the app, the timer, right? Whereas you go to a workshop and you have an instructor there to guide you through it, like you can just let go entirely. You don't have to worry about the time or a timer going off or a nap or your phone sitting right next to you. You can just like completely, what we always say, surrender. And it's just like a totally different experience for me.
That's one thing that's always blown me away. In my own practice, like experiencing what you just described, like if I'm ever in a group setting doing breath work, I'm like, this is a different thing. It really is.
Yeah.
And even as when I host workshops, like if I've got a group of 5 versus a group of 25, it's a different thing. Like there is this level of energy that builds that people connect to. And like, it's just, and I mean, to bring that to the next level, I assisted at one of when he does his sort of world tour, they did an event in Sydney and they had 1,000 or 1,100 people doing the breath work at the same time. And it was like electric. Like it was static on the arms. Like you could just feel this like building energy in this big warehouse. And it was like, whoa.
I just got the goosebumps thinking about it.
It really blew me away. But I've always said that to people, because quite often people that like you've discovered this practice and you're practicing at home, and people think, well, why go to a workshop? And I always encourage, like, it's a different thing. You really learn different things. You feel different things. And like you said, there's that ability to surrender and be like, all right, I'm being guided. I can go that little bit further. I can push that little bit harder, knowing there's a safety net there. There's someone trained and experienced that is there to sort of hold that space and just allow you to push that little bit further. But I often have people like that have practiced it for a year and then come to a workshop and they're like, what just happened?
Yep.
That's not the experience that I have every morning. And it's this group energy that you connect to.
It is. Yeah. So for me, like I said, I've been doing it for probably a little over a year now. And then my first workshop that I attended was this past September. And that experience was incredible in terms of just like the breathwork session and what I got out of it. And then this past weekend was my second workshop, and it was even better. Like, I wasn't expecting it, but it was even better than the first one. So for me, that was just like a really cool experience to have it amplified and even better than the first workshop. In terms of the benefits, we've talked about some of them with like, better sleep, better energy, improved mood. What are some of the other benefits that maybe we haven't covered that you'd like to share?
Yeah,
I know there's a lot there, right? There's like so much science. Whenever I ask that question with instructors, they're like, well, there's a lot. So feel free to take that wherever you'd like to.
Yeah, so I often sort of point to like categorizing. So there's like, what are the physical benefits? We can lose weight, we can improve energy, we can sort of set up a little bit more of a dynamic cardiovascular system because of that effect of cold. But then I also sort of separate the sort of psycho-emotional benefits. And for me, that's the biggest piece. And it's not why I got into it. I really got into it because of all those benefits we mentioned. But as I started doing workshops and as I started working one-on-one with people, I really started to notice like, oh, this is a really, really instrumental tool in teaching people how to better regulate their emotional state and how to respond constructively with stress. So for me, what I really teach, especially with the ice bath, is, yeah, you might want to do it for the cardiovascular benefits, the physical benefits, the endorphins, like there's so many you could choose. But for me, it's like, well, let's practice a really high stressful environment, all right? Let's put you in the firing seat, like of how are you going to respond when something happens? Because I often explain it's not if something happens in your life, it's when. Like, life is stressful. There's no way around that. And if you want to separate yourself from stress, you have to live in a little bubble somewhere. So instead of like avoiding stress, let's practice. Let's get better at dealing with stress. So when it does happen, that you've trained, you've practiced, you've put yourself in a really stressful environment, and you've practiced regulating your breath, calming your mind, softening your body. So that's transferable. That's a skill that you start to pick up on, that when something happens in your environment or your situation, bang, it's like autopilot. You start to come back to your breath, you take stock of the situation. So that's the big piece for me where I want to teach people, because we're getting more and more stressed. And I always put that term in sort of quotations because it's contextual. It means something different for everyone. But we all can practice how we respond. And Wim says like the ice bath is a mirror. It'll show you how you typically respond. And that's so true. Like, I watch people get in the bath that maybe try and fight, like, and get their way through it. And I talk to them afterwards, like, how do you encounter stress in your life? They're like, I just force my way through. I fight. And I'm like, how interesting. And some people get in and they jump back and they might tell me that they run away from stresses in their life. So like, what a wonderful opportunity to be in a very controlled setting, to have someone there facilitating and to see what is my response going to be when I am really, really high stress, right? Because an ice bath is really high stress. Like, not to sort of make it sound scary, but your body knows inherently, if you stay in there too long, you'll die. So there is this like full-blown stress response of like, shit, we got to get out of here. All right, what a wonderful opportunity to practice what's going to happen. And so that for me is the sort of, I guess, less spoken about benefit, because a lot of those benefits are like, oh, I'm losing weight, I'm getting stronger, I'm getting more energy, my sleep. But for me, it's like I'm actually practicing that when something stressful happens in my life, I've trained. Like, I know how I'm going to respond because I've done it tens and maybe hundreds of times if you've got your own sort of cold exposure practice. And then it becomes automatic. So that for me is probably the biggest benefit. Yeah,
it's so true. It's just a personal example. I used to handle stress very poorly. I would like get if stressful situation, I would get very stressed out. I would probably get angry, or like you could visibly see like my emotions get out of control. And now after practicing Wim Hof Method, also looking at how I respond when I'm in the ice bath, and now that I can be in a more relaxed state and control my breathing, I now look at how I react to stressful situations, and it's entirely different, in a good way.
Yeah, I notice like, I've never been a reactive person, so to speak, but since practicing the Wim Hof Method, what I've really noticed, and when people ask me like, what's all of the practice get you? And for me, the simplest way to describe it is time. Like, I notice that there's so much more space between something that perhaps is going to stress me out and the way I'm responding to it.
Yeah.
It's like, and same as the first time you get in an ice bath, it's like, oh, like there's this instant reaction.
Yep.
But once you practice that, there's this like, boom, yes, it's cold, yes, it's stressful, but I know what to do. And that's sort of transferred into my life. That, for an example, like someone cuts you off in traffic, instead of there that like,
Exactly.
there's just like, oh, this guy cut me off, and I can see myself responding. It's like,
Yep.
this doesn't need me to do anything.
Yeah.
There's space there that wasn't there before. It's like, bang, auto reaction, like that knee-jerk response. And I sort of talk to people about that. Like quite often, retrospectively, we're like, probably wasn't the best reaction.
Yep.
But when it's happening, it's just happening. There's not conscious, like, how should I respond to this? It's bang, automatic. But since practicing cold exposure in the Wim Hof method, now there's a space there. There's this stimulus, and what am I going to do about it? All right, I'm going to let it go. Rather than react and then regret, oh, that wasn't the best way to handle it. And that really, for me, is cold exposure has taught me that.
100%. That's a great example, because I used to have road rage where if someone cut me off, I'd be the person that's, laying on my horn and, you mother effer. And now I can just like take a deep breath and I'm like, he's probably just having a bad day, or he's probably, running late and he's got to get to this appointment, or got to get home to his wife and the kids, or, whatever it is. You look at things differently, right? It's a different perspective on life, I think.
Yeah, and it's probably not a reason. You wouldn't think that's going to be the benefit when you get into a practice like this. You're
True.
not necessarily like, I'm going to go to a Wim Hof workshop so I react less in traffic. But you notice that down the line, you're like, hey, that usually would have triggered me, and now it's not.
Yeah.
And so it isn't something that I think people consciously try and train, but it isn't a sort of side effect that's like, oh, I'm less reactive in these situations.
Yeah. One other thing I'd like to maybe touch on here with Wim Hof Method is, and it's specifically with my experience at the workshop, something that I don't get when I do the breath work on my own was the natural high that I got. And it happened to me that the first workshop I attended, and then this past weekend, like I said, it was even better, where, we're going through this breath work. It's usually after the first or second round of the 30 deep breaths, like once we get into third or fourth round, where I can just feel like most of my body, especially in my arms, just this tingling sensation that kind of runs up all the way like through my chest, up my neck, into my head. And I just feel so relaxed and so calm and so peaceful. It's honestly, I tell people it's the best natural high you can ever get. So maybe you can touch a little bit on that, like what's happening there when someone says that you get that natural high. And I know Wim always says, I get high on my own supply. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about what's happening there?
Yeah, so I like to look at it from sort of two perspectives. So firstly, like what we were touching on before, what I think one of the big difference between at-home practice by yourself in a group setting is there is this sort of coherence or syncing up. Like we have our sort of nervous system, and we have this own little electromagnetic field that they've sort of measured now from the heart and from the brain. And so there's a group of people breathing in sync at the same rhythm with the same intention. That starts to elevate the experience a little bit. And so I often have people being like, whoa, I got way more out of it in a group than I did at home. And so I think an aspect of it is that group energy. It's syncing up with the people in the room. It's that collective intention, collective energy. But in terms of, like, you can still, as you've probably experienced, you have the right breathing session even when yourself, and you feel that sort of bliss.
Definitely.
And it's the same. I try and just like to make analogies because people have probably experienced something like that in different settings. They call it the runner's high. If there's any sort of a long-term endurance runners that get into that zone where it's just, again, I would never call running blissful, but you speak to enough runners that get into that state, maybe 10 miles in, and they're like, it's utter bliss. And what it is to me is like we've moved through the stress response and your body is recognizing the relaxation. Like I've got through the battle. And so there is that sort of rebound effect of the physiology and the nervous system of like, I survived, I got through. And so because we often point to the ice bath as a really stressful thing, breath work's really stressful too. Like going into these hypercapnic states or hypoxic states, it's a physiological stress. And when we're holding our breath, particularly for those long periods of time, like we on average breathe 20, 25,000 times a day. Your conditioned mind is very receptive to that. So all of a sudden you stop for a minute, minute and a half, 2 minutes, and the body's like, oh, what's going on? This is the fight of our life. Like, let's switch on all the lights. Let's get ready. You take that breath and it's like, oh, I got through. And you just get this like, blissed out feeling of what to me is like survival. Your nervous system knows, all right, we got through that struggle. and let's almost reward ourselves, or let's get out of that fight flight system. Let's get out of the guarding, protecting, and just feel that thriving. And you feel that for sometimes an hour, a couple hours afterwards, where you're just like floating through the day, like everything's just like nice and blissed out. And to me, that's like, I faced that challenge. I got through that, whether it's physiological, whether it's the cold exposure, whether it's running, whether it's physical exercise. Again, like those people that really enjoy a good workout, you talk to them after a really heavy gym session, they're like, oh, it feels fantastic. Like I feel blissed out. And to me, it's like, again, all of these things are versions of a stress that we got through, right? So we faced that challenge, we got through that, and then the body rewards us with this feeling of like, oh, we made it through, let's feel good.
Right. Yeah, it was funny. After the breathwork session, I was, looking around the room, and everyone, I could just tell, was all in that same like blissful state that I was in. That probably lasted for most of the day for most of us. I know it did for me. And I was actually talking to one guy, and he was like, because I wanted to know what his experience was. And he said he had that same kind of tingling sensation, that same blissful state. And then he told me, he's like, yeah, I feel like I'm on a different planet right now. I'm like, yeah, man, that's a really good way of describing it. It's something that's literally out of this world.
It's honestly my favorite thing. Like I host a lot of workshops, particularly when I'm in Australia, just where I live. It's a smallish town, and sort of word spreads. I'm the only instructor anywhere in that sort of region. So lots of people come to the workshop. And my favorite thing is like that 15 minutes post breath work where I just go around the room and be like, just share. If you want to share, share. And people have these like far out stories of where they went and like what they experienced. And what really gets me is they're all different. Like it's not that everyone has this experience. It's like, oh, I went and I saw this. I had these shapes and colors. This is what happened in my body. And then the next person's completely different. Yeah. And that to me is like, wow, how can this one... And what I always explain to people, it's not one size fits all. It's not do this breath and this is what will happen.
Sure.
For you, it can be completely different to someone else. But people just sort of like, and you see, like you looked across the room and you saw the look on everyone's face of like, oh, we feel a bit altered. Like you're in this different state. And that's a wonderful place to be that I think not enough of us have access to or experience. And I actually think back, I had this French guy at my workshop a couple of months ago that we were sharing, and he just started crying afterwards, and I thought it was maybe an emotional thing. He's like, I'm crying because I've never felt so good in my life, and I'm 35. Like, why has it taken me so long to feel what I just felt? Like, I feel complete utter joy and bliss, and I'm upset that it took me 35 years to find that. And I didn't have to take anything. I didn't have to do it. Like, it was just breathing, and all of a sudden I'm feeling like a completely different person. And so I think that state is like pretty magical for people. Especially that it's an endogenous sort of response. Like you created it. All you did was breathe. And all of a sudden you feel like a different person. And that's something that I think when you experience that, you sort of want to come back to it. You're like, I want to touch that again. Which is the wonderful thing. And I think as you become more consistent with a practice, it gets easier and easier to get back to that state.
Sure. That's what's so fascinating to me about it, is that it's natural and it's free, right? Like it's free to breathe. I mean, I'm sure, of course, when you go to workshops, you pay, but you can practice it on your own, and it's completely free and it's completely natural. So that piece is in and of itself is really cool.
On that other part of like what I always explain, like it's free. You don't need any equipment. You don't need any special, like it really, once you get the hang of it, you could be anywhere in any sort of setting and take that 5, 10, 15 minutes to yourself and like create that shift in your state. Like, and that's what I often explain to people. Like once you get the hang of it, sure, it might take you a bit of consistency to find your own sort of rhythm and how long you need to breathe for and what your breath holds are going to be. But once you've got that, it's very accessible, like, and almost instantaneous. Like, within, and I often sort of talk about like this, I guess it's the theory or the concept of like Pavlov's dog, where when I now take my first 5 breaths, my body knows exactly what's happening.
Right.
And it's like it lets all that tension go. It lets my mind be quiet. Like it knows where I'm going. Like I'm going into this super calm state, and it just like takes me there really quickly. And I find the same thing like the breath work I do before bed. Within like 3 breaths of this very specific pattern that I do every night before I go to bed, my nervous system and my brain knows, oh, this is that thing we do before we go to sleep. So let's just go there. Yeah. And so it starts to set up this, again, like a conditioned response of like this pattern of breath triggers a response from the nervous system. And then it becomes easier and easier to get there. So what might take 3 or 4 or 5 rounds initially can start to occur in 1 round because your brain knows where we're going.
Exactly. Yeah, that's one thing I'm trying to work on a little bit more, is being more consistent. And I was just having a conversation with somebody yesterday about this, how there are days where I just don't feel like doing the breath work, to be honest. Like, it's not that I look at it as a chore, but there are days where I'm like, oh man, I have all this stuff on my plate already. I have this meeting and this podcast recording and this and that. And it's very easy to kind of skip over it on certain days. So I'm trying to get more into a state of mind, like the mindset that we always talk about, of just at least doing 1 round, and then it becomes a little bit easier. Maybe once you get into 1 round, you're like, okay, I can do another one. And then at that point it becomes habit. You can do a lot more consistently and much easier.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting piece. And I still, 3.5, 4 years later, experience that exact same thing. Like, I wake up some days, I'm like, I don't feel like doing it today, right? Or I got too much on my plate. But and look, don't get me wrong, I've skipped days in the last 4 years. Like, it's not that it's every single day. I do try and be as consistent as I can, but I always know without fail that those days that I don't want to do it, if I do push myself to do 1 round, I will do a second, I will do a third, and then afterwards I'm like, oh, I feel so much better. Right? Like, I'm so glad I pushed through that resistance. Yeah. So I often, it's like that analogy of people that want to start exercising. Like, first step, put the shoes near the door. Second step, maybe you go for a little walk, and it compounds, it builds. So like, all right, I don't have time today, I'll do 1 round. And then like, I'm in the retention, I'm like, I could do a second round. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, here I am. Like, and it's just such a nice shift again of that state. And sometimes we do have to push through that resistance. It exists, but I always feel better on the other side for pushing through.
Absolutely. Going back to some of the benefits, like for me, all of the benefits that I see or read about or experience myself, they all make sense. Like, it makes sense that it helps with stress and improves your mood, and there's anti-inflammatory benefits and better sleep and so on. But there is the one, and you've mentioned it, that it can help with losing weight. And somebody actually just the other day asked me, they're like, yeah, I've heard that it can help you lose weight. And I honestly didn't know the answer to why. Like, why might that be? And for me, the only explanation that I could think of in that moment was that, and this is just based on my own experience, is that practicing the Wim Hof method, breath work in general, cold exposure, it's helped me just live more healthy. Like, I just want to be a healthy person. Like, I want to eat cleaner. I want to get more movement in. And it's probably because I'm getting more energy from it that I now have more energy where I want to go out for longer walks and runs and just be more active. So is that maybe the case, or is there another explanation for why it may help some people lose weight?
There is, so I point to 2 other things, but I think that's a really nice, again, like an explanation of why. And I often call the Wim Hof method a gateway drug. Yep. Because like you said, like, all of a sudden I'm feeling better, maybe I want to do more. And once I start doing more, maybe I want to fuel myself with better nutrients. And so it does start to open those doors of just sort of more awareness of what you're eating, how you're moving, how you're sleeping, the other elements of your sort of day-to-day experience. But in terms of the more, I guess, physiological or scientific mechanism, I point to 2 things. So we have this thermoregulatory capacity, and our body is very much driven to homeostasis, and we have our baseline body temperature where everything works at that temperature. So we have an inherent drive in our body to be at that homeostasis point. And that's controlled by the hypothalamus. So when we get cold, the body notices, and we sort of induce shivering to warm up initially, to bring us back to that neutral point. So if we jump in an ice bath, we drop the body temperature. Okay, you're in there for a couple of minutes, body temperature drops. How do we get our body temperature back up to homeostasis? We have to burn calories. Right? That's the only way your body really knows how to generate heat. Shivering is one way. It's not very efficient. And so what we do is we start to burn through calories. So you see cellular metabolism goes up because I need to produce heat to get myself back to my physiological baseline. And then the second aspect is something that's relatively new in terms of like what they've understood about that thermoregulatory capacity is something called brown adipose tissue or brown fat. So initially when they started studying Wim, they thought like, oh, he can do all this crazy cold stuff because he's got lots of brown fat. And so brown fat is a little bit different to what we typically know as fat, which is white fat, which is a storage system. Brown fat actually produces energy, or it burns calories. So babies have a lot. And until relatively recently, we thought by the age of sort of 20 to 25, adults didn't have any brown fat. We lose that as we grow up because babies can't shiver. They don't have enough muscular capacity to generate heat. So they need to have something that can heat up their body if temperatures are cold. As we get older, as we get bigger, as our muscles get bigger, we can start to produce heat from shivering. So we lose that white fat. But the reason why they thought it didn't exist is because most of us live a pretty comfortable life in terms of temperature, right? And what they started seeing and how they discovered this is they were doing, it was a completely different sort of study, but they were putting someone in a cold room and doing a body scan. And they noticed all of these little, what they thought were tumors in this scan. And they're like, oh, this guy's got all of this stuff across his sort of traps around his throat and his neck. And what they actually discovered, because it was in a cold room, his brown fat was active. And then they studied someone like Wim, and essentially the more you do cold exposure, the more we convert white fat to brown fat. So your body starts to increase its capacity to generate heat almost at will. There is techniques you can do, and Wim teaches a brown fat activation where you can do a certain breath technique and a certain squeeze, and it's not necessarily a beginner's practice. It does take a little bit of work, but when it happens, it's pretty amazing. You just feel like ripples of heat across the shoulders, and it's like, the first time I experienced it, I was in like an ice cold shower in Scotland, and I honestly thought someone had turned the tap to warm. Like all of a sudden, the freezing water hitting me, I was like, oh, like something's happened to the water system because now it's warm water hitting me. And that was just the body like turning on. And so brown fat has something called an uncoupling protein, which basically when it's triggered, it sets off this little chain reaction and just burns, and that produces heat. And to see it in action, like when you do the instructor training, you spend sort of 6 days with Wim in Poland, and you do this hike. And I was walking maybe 6 feet behind him, and he is literally radiating heat. Like it's minus 15 Celsius. Everyone's wearing shorts, and I'm standing there. He's like glowing red, and I can feel heat coming off him. I'm like, what the hell is going on? Like, and they told this story that they did an expedition on one of the mountains, and someone like started to have a bit of a panic attack, and was like, the weather turned bad. And it was getting a little bit sort of anxious. And Wim came over and sat down, and he said, just hold on a second. And they all stood around him and warmed their hands off him as he sat there doing this brown fat activation.
Wow.
And when I heard that before I was standing behind him, I'm like, that sounds a little bit far out. Like I couldn't really get behind it. Sure. But then standing off it, I'm like, I can actually feel like heat coming off this guy.
Wow.
I was like, whoa. And so he's got obviously a very... he's very able to activate that more or less at will. Yeah. But it's shown that, and they've done a lot of Rhonda Patrick, who goes into a lot of sort of cold shock and thermogenesis. Yep. They've shown that sort of prolonged, or not even prolonged, but consistent exposure to cold, adults start to develop brown fat again. So it's not just that it exists in children and not in adults. It's because most adults don't expose themselves to cold. Yeah. But as soon as we start doing that at a regular practice, we start to build those brown fat stores. And white fat converts to brown fat. So that weight loss can come from some of the white storage tissue being converted into brown adipose tissue.
Super interesting. I like your explanation a lot better than mine. And just saying that it makes me feel better and I have more energy. That's really good explanation. And it reminds me of the importance of getting outside of that comfort zone that we are all so familiar with, especially in today's modern world where everything is around comfort. And that's why I think there's so many benefits to things like, cold exposure and hormesis in general, is that we're stepping outside of that comfort zone to develop new mechanisms to help us live healthier and live longer. So it's super cool. In terms of breathwork, I know we've covered so much on breathwork here. But I want to kind of dive into that a little bit deeper, especially the work that you're doing. Why is it important for us to learn about our breath? And for me, like, it's not just learning the technique. Once I've learned the technique, I feel like I've learned more about my body, my mind, my soul. So what is it in terms of the importance of learning about our own breath?
I think that's such an amazing insight that not everyone has initially, but like you just beautifully phrased it, the more you learn about your breath, the more you really learn about yourself in all of those different systems. So I like to think of like awareness of breath really is awareness of self, and it's awareness of situation, because if you notice how you're breathing, then you're pretty aware of what's going on. And so I really like to think of, number one, our breath affects how we feel. So I can breathe in a certain way, it's going to change how I feel. But number two, it reflects how I feel. All right, you breathe differently when you're really anxious than you do when you're really relaxed. So it's this perfect little like window into our autonomic nervous system, right? And physiology and psychology are very intertwined. So if your physiology is a bit stressed out and out of whack, your mind is as well. Okay, and if your mind's racing with thoughts, your breath's going to be affected. So it's this like beautiful sort of system that's been developed in us that gives us a window into like, all right, well, how am I doing today? And I can look at my carbon dioxide tolerance or my breath hold capacity, or just the quality of my breath. Is it moving freely? Is it labored? Am I forcing it? Like, because that tells me a lot of things. That tells me, like, is my body happy? Have I rested well? Am I eating the right things? Is my mind in the process, or am I sort of anxious and thinking about things in the future? And the more that you can learn about these little sort of fluctuations and subtle changes in your breath, the more you start to understand like what triggers you, what makes you feel upset. And I sort of conducted this sort of N=1 experiment on myself for quite a while, where I really worked over a couple of months, just like breath awareness. Like, how am I breathing at different times of the day? How am I breathing when I do feel a certain emotion? Like if I feel stressed, like, all right, my next step is going to be, what's my breathing doing? When I feel excited, what's my breathing doing? And you start to work out all of these different patterns, okay, that then I got to the point where I would notice my breathing change before I had this conscious note of I'm feeling X, Y, or Z. And so I would feel this subtle shift in my breath. And then about a few seconds later, I'd be like, oh, I'm irritated by this email I'm writing or whatever. But whatever it was, I started to notice the breathing change before the mind. And so I was like, wow, this now gives me this, again, that little space between stimulus and response, that I'm noticing my breathing change. I can change it back. I can change it to my calm breath or my excited breath or whatever it might be. And there's some pretty cool research into this, I guess, interrelationship between our respiratory patterns and our emotional states. We know now, and they did, I'll probably get the study wrong and I can't remember the authors of it, but they took a group of people initially and they told them to sort of try and experience certain emotions. So let's think of something really traumatic. And what they were doing was they were monitoring their breath. They weren't telling them that. They just said, we want you to experience, all right, feel really stressed. Think of something that stresses you out. And they'd sit there, and what the study was doing was looking at their breath patterns. Then they took a second group of people, brought them in and said, hey, can you breathe like this and tell us how you feel? And when they made the people breathe like the people felt stressed, that new cohort of people like, oh, this makes me feel a bit stressed. Let's breathe like someone that felt anxious. Oh, I feel a bit anxious. So they started to see that, again, the breath reflects how someone feels, but it also affects how someone feels. And if you don't know the difference between your stressed out breath and your relaxed breath, then there's not a lot you can do when you feel stressed or relaxed. Right? If you start to understand, all right, I know what the pattern of my breath that makes me feel really calm, or the pattern of my breath that I adopt when I'm feeling really calm, then the next time you're feeling super stressed out, you do your calm breath, all right? Because that's that signal to your nervous system, oh, if I'm breathing really calm, I must be really calm. Because it's this evolutionary sort of adaptation. You don't take a really slow, long, soft exhale when you're being chased by a tiger, right? And so your body knows that your breath is reflective of your environment, okay? If your brain knows, shit, something's going on, we better run away, okay? Versus like, oh, my breath is silent, it's soft, my diaphragm's moving, I'm relaxed. So we can hijack that system, right? Something's making me feel really stressed and anxious, but if I can control my breath and I can make my breath tell my brain, I'm safe, it's okay, then that physiology will affect the psychology. And so it's this wonderful insight that the more you learn about your own breath, the more you learn about yourself. Like, what makes me feel X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so there was something that was mentioned at the workshop that I was at this past weekend, Wim Hof workshop. And I think I saw it on your website too when I was doing some research. It's the saying of the breath is the remote control of our nervous system. And I think that's pretty much everything that you were just describing. Was there anything else that you wanted to elaborate on that phrase?
Yeah, so I like to take it one step further. So whenever I teach people, like I explain, the nervous system is really the operating system of the body. And like the sort of, I guess most people can grasp the concept of an operating system. It runs the show. Yep. And then the breath is the remote control of that operating system. So that's our sort of way in. But for me, I really like one of the biggest things I teach is about the autonomic nervous system. Mm-hmm. And I like to explain, or my sort of take on things is there's a bit of a mismatch now. Like our nervous system developed over eons, all right? And it developed in an environment that's very different to today. And we don't adapt that fast. It's not like our nervous system's like, oh, this is the modern world where there's telephones and lights and artificial, like all of the stuff that happens in today's world that didn't happen hundreds of thousands of years ago when our nervous system developed. So we need to sometimes take control over that system, and our breath is the way we can do it. And so quite often I think the sympathetic nervous system gets a bit of a bad rap because it's the stress response. And let's remember, it keeps us alive. Like that's what wakes you up in the morning. That's how you jump out of a near coming car. Like sympathetic nervous system is not bad. Again, it's contextual. If you spend all your day in the sympathetic nervous system, sure, terrible, right? But to say that it's bad is missing that context of it's a dynamic, flexible system.
Sure.
But what happens to a lot of people, because there's all of these little micro stresses, like we're no longer dealing with the tiger coming out of the bushes, which is how the nervous system developed. Okay, I need to respond to this threat and I need to run away or I need to fight. Now I'm dealing with emails and deadlines and traffic and poor sleep. The generic response is the same. All right? My body thinks there's hundreds of little tigers coming at me, and the emails and the deadlines are all little tigers. All right? And so that jacks up the nervous system a little bit. How do we come back into that? I'm back in the cave. I got away from the tiger. All right. There's a few strategies. Like we can reverse engineer the nervous system. We can use our visual field. We can use our voice. We can use our posture. But breathing's the fastest way. Breathing controls that nervous system, because if I start taking those long, slow breaths, I send that message that there's no tigers attacking me because my breathing's not reflecting that. So thinking of the nervous system as really what runs the show, and the breathing, which is the sort of remote control to that nervous system. And by taking control of your breath, you start to learn how to use that remote, right? Because again, like you wake up in the middle of the night and you're awake, what are you going to do to go to sleep? Okay, do we reach for a sleeping pill or perhaps some less constructive habits? Or can I use my breath, which will tell the nervous system to turn off again? Like maybe it's mid-afternoon, you don't want to have another coffee, but you've got a deadline or a presentation to do. How do I turn the nervous system? How do I get into that sympathetic state? Increase the arousal levels. Again, breath's the fastest way to do that. So I can start to grab a hold of that system and direct the nervous system to what's relevant in that moment.
Yeah, I love that. And that's something I use if I wake up during the night and need to fall back asleep. I use breath work. I like to do box breathing. There's different formats of box breathing, but I usually just do 4 inhale, hold for 2 seconds, exhale 6, hold for 2, inhale 4, just repeat 5 or 6, 7 times. And that really works. It really helps me fall back asleep.
Yeah, I've encountered the exact same thing. My sleep was for quite a long time really bad until I discovered breath work. And one of the things that would keep me up, or I'd wake up in the middle of the night and then my mind would start. And I'm like, what do I have to do tomorrow? What didn't I get done today? And I'd just be like, stuck in this loop. And then breath work, I think it's a 2-part effectiveness. Number 1 is that nervous system regulation. You're breathing in a way that's telling yourself parasympathetic, rest and digest. Let's turn the nervous system off. But if you're also counting, like I'm counting in for 4, I hold for 2, I'm counting out for 6, you can't think while you're counting.
True.
So it sort of takes away that distraction of like preparing for tomorrow because you just start counting. And that's quite like calming for the nervous system, because that's what kept me up was my mind. It wasn't that I was like ready to jump out of bed. It was like I couldn't stop thinking. And so introducing where I actually like count in my head and breathe in a pattern that's going to turn the nervous system into that more relaxed state was super effective. I'd be like, all right, I'm going to do 5 rounds. And by round 3, I would wake up the next day like, oh, I guess that worked.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way in terms of it taking your mind off of whatever your mind was racing around. Because I always just looked at it as the physiology of the breath work and didn't take into account the mental aspect of focusing on counting and not worrying about the deadline I have to hit tomorrow, or the project I have to work on, or the emails I need to respond to, or whatever it was that was keeping me awake. That's super interesting. While we're talking about sleep and breath work, another thing I've incorporated probably a few months back was mouth taping, because I was a mouth breather, especially during sleeping. And now I do mouth taping. For those that are listening and don't know and think I'm crazy, you just put a little piece of tape over your mouth, and it sounds wacky if you've never done it, but it really works, at least for me. It might not work for everybody, but do you have any opinions or thoughts on mouth taping, and maybe just the idea overall? It doesn't necessarily have to be during sleep, but the idea overall of mouth breathing versus nasal breathing.
Yeah, so I think it's like, I was a mouth breather as well. I would wake up every morning with like split lips and a really dry throat, and I'd be like just not rested. And then I read Patrick McKeown's book, The Oxygen Advantage, which is where I first learned about like mouth taping. And the first couple of nights, like I'd wake up and I'd pull it off. I'd wake up in the morning, it's on the floor, but I persisted. And then all of a sudden I was just like sleeping so well. I'd wake up in the morning like, whoa, I've never felt so restored. And again, for me, and you'll notice almost everything I talk about comes back to the nervous system, but the nervous system's got these certain triggers. So when we breathe through the mouth, again, when do we breathe through the mouth? It's like I'm running away, all right, because I'm trying to move as much air as I can because something's probably chasing me, okay? Whereas when I breathe with the nose, I'm more in a relaxed state. So mouth breathing is linked to the sympathetic nervous system, nasal breathing linked to the parasympathetic. So as soon as we open the mouth, and it might be a little bit more subtle than what I'm explaining, but there's a little part of the brain that like wakes up and be like, what's happening? Why are we breathing through the mouth? Is there something I need to be worried about? Is there a threat? So there's that, what's called cortical arousal. Your brain sort of wakes up a little bit because it's being signaled by your breath that perhaps there's something that we need to be prepared for. Secondarily, and I think is less, well, it's just as relevant for sleep, but I think more just in aspects of physiology, the nose has got lots of resistance. There's these turbines in the nose, there's the paranasal sinuses. So as you breathe in and out, there's some resistance to the air. When you breathe through your mouth, there's a much wider aperture. There's no resistance to the air. We actually breathe out a lot more carbon dioxide than we should. And that starts to sort of narrow our bandwidth of tolerance, right? So our pH is very regulated by our breath, right? I breathe faster, I breathe more CO2 out, my pH goes up. But again, if we think back to that little conversation about cold exposure, our body's very driven to this homeostasis point. It wants to be at 7.36 pH. All right, and any fluctuation from that, it's going to do what it needs to do to bring you back into balance. If I'm breathing through my mouth all day, I'm breathing out a lot of CO2, I'm creating a very narrow bandwidth of tolerance. And anything that stretches me out of that is going to create a response in the body, whether it's anxiety, whether it's my mind, whether it's a physical sensation. But what's happening is my body is recognizing, oh, I'm outside of my comfort zone, I got to get back in there. So a lot of people, even if they're relatively conscious throughout the day, you go to sleep, your breath slows down. We know our respiratory rate goes down when we're asleep. If your mouth opens, we start again creating this really narrow bandwidth. And then as my breath gets slower and slower, the CO2 level goes up, and that wakes up the brain. Because, oh, like, why is the CO2 gone up? I'm outside of my bandwidth of tolerance. So it's a really interesting thing that I think, and I can't remember what the percentage is, but they did a big study on sleep apnea, and they looked at carbon dioxide tolerance. And a big portion of sleep apnea is a structural anatomical thing, like a thick throat or a tongue that sort of blocks the airway. But quite a big percentage of it is physiological. This cortical arousal of, I've got such a narrow tolerance to carbon dioxide that as my breath rate goes down, the CO2 goes up and my brain wakes up. It's like, oh, okay. And the other part of that, coming back to the nervous system, if I'm breathing through the mouth, I might be tired and I might be asleep, but it's like my nervous system's humming away in the background because I'm telling it something's in my environment that I'm worried about. I'm breathing through my mouth. I need to be ready to run. So we might fall asleep and we might become in that unconscious sleep state, but the nervous system's like, where is the threat coming from? So it's a very low level of restfulness because it's this preparation. So I'm a huge proponent of mouth taping. And again, I often like to point to people, the idea is not to like seal off your lips. It's to provide a gentle reminder to the little muscles of your jaw to keep your jaw closed. Right. So I just put a really sort of thin vertical strip that I could still breathe out of the side of my mouth if I needed to. I can sort of talk if I had to, But as my mouth wants to open, there's that little bit of a catch of the tape that just reminds me, keep my mouth closed, keep my mouth closed, keep my mouth closed. And that just becomes a trained thing that over time it should become automatic. Like I don't do it every night now, but say I've changed beds or I've gone traveling or I've had a couple of days where my sleep's been off, I'll just tape it again for the 5 to 7 days, and it just sort of kicks me back into that gear. But it completely transformed my sleep. Yeah,
same. There's a few things I want to touch on there. I do the same. I just have a thin vertical strip. You know, I think a lot of people think you have to like tape your entire mouth shut. But if I forget 1 or 2 nights, I'm at a point now where I've been doing it for a few months, that if I just forget one night, I still feel like I'm in a spot now where I can breathe through my nose. Like I feel like I've trained myself to the point where I don't necessarily need to do mouth taping every single night. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on was I used to be, and I guess I still am, somebody that needs about 8 hours of sleep. But I used to be somebody that like really needed at least 8 hours. Like if I got less than 8 hours, I was not functioning well the next day. And now that I've been doing the mouth taping, I'm noticing I'm getting into a deeper state of sleep and just better quality of sleep overall. That if I happen to get 6 hours of sleep, like I'm good. Like I wake up and I feel well rested. And that part I was not expecting at all. It's pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, I'm been slowly, and again, breathwork is this sort of gateway, but I've been looking more into the importance of sleep. And like as someone explained it, as it's the best performance enhancing drug that exists is sleep. It's good sleep. And like so many of the systems in the body require that period of time where it's repair, it's restore, it's recover. And again, if I'm not optimizing sleep, and whether that's because I'm mouth breathing or that's I go to bed in a very sympathetic nervous system state because of lights and devices, and I haven't sort of discharged some of the day, which I often do with breath work at night, it's like, all right, I'm telling my nervous system the day's done. All those little tigers are gone. It's okay and it's safe to switch everything off. Right? But if we don't use that remote control, like a lot of people finish dinner and their emails, and then they maybe watch something or they're on the social media, and then they lay down and they wonder why they can't fall asleep. Well, I've just given my brain all of this stimulus of like, turn on, turn on, turn on. And now I'm like trying to close my eyes and like frustrated that I'm not asleep. Well, I haven't taken the necessary steps to tell my brain and my body and my nervous system that it's okay to turn off, that there's not any tigers around, and we can go into that restful state. So I think way too many people try to sleep in a sympathetic nervous system state, or at least not quite as far into that parasympathetic state as they should be. That doesn't require a lot of know-how. It's like, all right, do a specific breathing pattern, turn off your devices maybe an hour before bed. Try and maybe write some stuff down if you've got stuff on your mind. Like go through these little simple processes that allow your sleep to become restorative, and so that you wake up the next day feeling fresh, rather than like dragging yesterday with you and like, just pulling yourself out of bed in the morning and like slowly getting things going.
Yeah. For me, I think sleep is probably the number one thing to focus on if you're looking to make drastic changes to your health overall. I think starting with sleep is a really good idea, because if you want to eat better, that's a good thing, and exercise more. But if you don't get good sleep, you're not going to set yourself up for success in those other areas of life. It's not going to happen. You're going to feel sluggish and tired, and cognitive function will go down. And for me, it's like the foundational piece. So I'm with you. I'm definitely trying to learn a lot more about good quality sleep.
Yeah, and I think a difficult part is like, now that we know how sleep is so important, it's become stressful for people again. Like, my sleep's not good, so now I'm like anxious before I go to bed with what if I don't get a good night's sleep, and all of these bad things are going to happen. So I heard it described as like this meta stress, that now I'm stressed about being stressed, that I can't sleep. And it just starts this like kind of vicious cycle.
Yeah.
So I often like point to people, like, it might be a slow process. You don't have to fix it overnight.
Exactly.
And look, we're pretty damn resilient. Like, you can cope with a few bad nights or a few weeks of bad nights while you try and fix it up. So I always like to remind people that it's not the end of the world, and that you can start trying to make these little changes and adjustments, and the sleep will improve, but not to let it become its own version of stress, that now it's adding fuel to the fire rather than putting it out.
Exactly. And to that point, and we were talking about this a little bit before our call here, is in the biohacking world, I feel like it's gotten to a point where we focus so much on numbers and biometrics and data and our wearables, and just like always analyzing all of the data, the health data that we have access to. And some of that can be great, right? There's so many awesome tools out there. I personally love talking about biohacking and incorporating biohacks in my life, but I think we've gotten to a point where we're almost stressing out about it too much, that it's like defeating the purpose. And what you and I were talking about beforehand is like, I would much rather focus on some of those natural biohacks of getting outside and getting natural, sunlight and fresh air and things like grounding and just being in nature, things that are accessible to us or hopefully for most of us, and things that are free, like what we were talking about before. So yeah, that's a big piece is not letting some of these things overstress you, and just kind of take smaller steps and focus on some of the more natural hacks.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I'm really, I feel the same way, and I think we've got to a point where we're almost outsourcing our idea of how we feel. And I've had, again, people come to the workshop that have got their Whoop or their ordering, and they're completely reliant on that data to tell them how they're feeling.
Yep.
And I'm like, hey, that data is really important, but you should be correlating what that tells you and how you actually feel. Stop, close your eyes, and just tune in. Are you feeling? What's your readiness score tell you? But what does your actual body tell you? And you should be able to use the data to correlate. Okay, when my readiness score tells me I'm ready to go, what does that feel like for me? But I should really take time to register on an internal sense of what does that feel like. And when my readiness score is really low, how do I notice that? What are the signals from myself? Because otherwise I'm completely dependent on a number to tell me whether I should go to the gym or do yoga. But really, what is that number? It's tracking your fluctuations in your body temperature and your breath and all of these things that you've got access to.
Yes.
You just need to learn how to read those signals, okay? And carbon dioxide tolerance is a really good one, how long you can gently hold your breath in the morning. And if you've got a baseline of that, perhaps you're 10 seconds low one day, well, there's your readiness score. That's your body telling you, I didn't rest very well last night, or I didn't like what you ate. Perhaps today's a day where we take it a little bit slow. Or again, you check that number every day and it's really high. Great, today's a day to do the heavy things and do the active things. But if I'm dependent on that and then perhaps my Bluetooth dies or the thing dies and well, now what am I going to do? Can I go to the gym or can I not? But if I only use that data instead of correlating how I actually feel, then that in itself becomes another form of stress of
exactly.
Well, I don't know what I'm able to do today.
Yep.
So I think 100%. It's really important people take that opportunity to be interoceptive and all right, what does it feel like when my Oura ring tells me I'm ready to go and I'm well recovered? What does that look like for me? And that way I tune in a little bit more to these internal workings, because that's really what your information should be coming from. It's how you feel, physically, mentally, emotionally. Am I ready to go or am I feeling a bit low? Yes.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, is just to pay attention more to our thoughts and feelings and emotions, right? We have all this tech available to us in that data, but I think we need to get back to feeling, right? Feeling like a human being. So yeah, I agree with everything you just said there. How about your breath work that you're doing either on your own or with your clients? I understand you have, you hold workshops, and within this past year, you've been doing some virtual workshops. Tell us a little bit more about that and the kind of the key takeaways of the breath work that you're doing.
Yeah, so I really since going down the road of the Wim Hof method, that's, I guess, my primary tool, especially for Wim Hof method workshops. But that's really opened the door to me to all of these other methodologies. And there's hundreds out there.
Sure.
And what I really what I sort of discovered and through the work of certain teachers and mentors, that the methods are many. There's rebirthing, there's holotropic, there's Wim Hof, there's transformational, there's literally hundreds.
Yeah.
The principles are very few. Okay, we're all of these techniques, these methods are manipulating your physiology, your nervous system, and your biomechanics. Yep. And so if you understand those principles, you can start to make your own methods. And that's what I really encourage people to do, is not create their own method for the idea of something else, but your breath's like a fingerprint. It's unique to you. So if you can understand these sort of physiological or biochemical manipulations that you do with your breath, and you understand your biomechanics of chest breathing versus diaphragmatic breathing, and you understand your nervous system of sympathetic and parasympathetic, then how you feel on a certain day will dictate your practice. So I have a very sort of fluid practice that I wake up in the morning. I always try and do my breath work first thing in the morning because it's a nice way just to sort of start my day.
Yep.
But I sort of feel into how I'm feeling. All right. I'd look at my sort of cadence of my breath. Am I breathing quickly or slowly? My breath hold ability. Perhaps I didn't rest as well last night. And then I'll start to just feel my way into a nice, deep, rhythmical breath. So I guess create an adaptation of the Wim Hof method. That's my favorite form of breath work, that a superventilation or a period of active breath followed by a retention. And that, again, if we think about all those principles, it's like physiologically that active breath is shifting my biochemistry, and then that retention is allowing it to balance again, right? That active breath is putting me into the sympathetic nervous system. The retention comes back into my parasympathetic. Okay, biomechanically, that active breath is really working my diaphragm. The retention is relaxed. So it's like interval training. And I start to just sort of work into some of those patterns, incorporating some active breathing. It might be fast, it might be slow, it might be nasal, it might be mouth, just depending on how I'm feeling of the day. But I'll also do some breath holds. I might do inhale holds, I might do exhale holds. I've currently, like this last couple of weeks, I've been really enjoying hypoxia, which is more moving into that low oxygen state. So perhaps towards the end of a retention, instead of taking in that nice big breath in and holding, I'll take a little half breath and then exhale again and see if I can drop down a little bit lower and wait to get that urge to breathe. And again, a little breath and drop back down and really let my body feel like what low oxygen is. And I've got a little pulse oximeter and I can watch my oxygen levels really dropping and then bringing in that nice big inhale. So it's pretty flexible, it's pretty fluid, but I like to incorporate the principles of nervous system physiology and biomechanics.
So good. So good. I love that. Before we get to my last question or two here, where can people find more about you? You have a website, you're on social. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about where can people go to find more about you?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Instagram. I'm at Breath Body Therapy. I also do have a website, same name, breathbodytherapy.com. I've got a YouTube channel, but yeah, most active on Instagram. So I work with one-on-one. I work with people one-on-one. I also do sort of corporate wellness as well. But I really try and take all of the principles that we've talked about and incorporating that into like how to get you better in touch with your nervous system, how to understand your own physiology, and how to develop a breathwork practice that's really unique to you rather than this one-size-fits-all, go and practice this. I incorporate a lot of my sort of physical therapy knowledge as well. So I work with people in terms of movement and posture and sort of just what I call movement snacks and good habits to give that well-rounded approach, because breathing for me is probably the foundational pillar that if you get that right, everything else gets a bit easier. Yeah. But we also need to incorporate the things that we sort of touched on, like light and food and sleep cycles and energy and all of these other pillars that give us that sort of optimal experience. I share lots of sort of just, that's something I've been doing at the moment that gets a lot of good responses, these 1 minute techniques. So Instagram gives you 1 minute of a video before it turns into an IGTV. So I've tried to condense a lot of practices down into 1 minute. Cool. Just to get people's short attention span and give them really simple practices. To be like, what can you do in a minute? Like, you can feel different. And so if you can experience that, all right, I do this 30 seconds of a certain technique and I might feel more energized or more relaxed. Great, that's a piece of information. So I know that technique has this effect on me. Because that's one thing that's really surprised me is I can lay 10 people down and do one very specific breathing practice and 3 people feel it makes them more alert and awake, and 3 people feel it puts them to sleep, and 3 people are in the middle. So it's not necessarily the practice itself, it's your response to it. It's the interaction with your nervous system and physiology. And that's why I think working usually one-on-one or at least working with someone to understand like how these practices affect you is more beneficial. Like you learn a lot more rather than like going on the app and just breathing how you think you should breathe and like, I didn't feel the way that I expected to feel. Well, maybe there's some certain tweaks or adjustments there that you can make.
So good. I love that. Campbell, this has been a rock solid convo. I really appreciate everything you've shared, your expertise. One thing I would like to maybe end the conversation on, I know something that was discussed at the workshop this past weekend, which I knew, but it's a good reminder for all of us, is that we've entered this world with breath, right? We took our first breath. That's how we started our life. And it's the very last thing that we do is take a breath, your final breath. And I think that just goes to show how powerful breath can be. So I just wanted to leave our audience with that to think about.
Yeah, I love that. It does point to the importance of it, and we can't really remove that or get away from it. And so I always like to tell people, let it be an invitation. Like, don't let it be another thing that you're doing wrong or that you have to add. Just let it be an invitation. Like, start to experience your breath and see how it changes. And don't have like these hard, fast set rules or ideas of what it's going to. Just start to explore it. Like, see how it moves and how it feels and how you're breathing in certain situations and environments. And that will typically be enough motivation to be like, oh, wow, it changes a lot. And I've noticed that I breathe a certain way when I'm feeling stressed or anxious. That for people's like, now I want to know more. Like, now I want to dive a little bit deeper. So just start with that invitation of like, just try and notice your breathing today. Like the 20,000 breaths that you're going to take, maybe notice 1% of them. Yeah. Can you notice 200 breaths and see how they move today? Because that will open the door and give you a lot of insight into the sort of workings of your body and your environment.
Yes. So good. There's one final question I almost forgot to ask you that I'd like to wrap up conversation with, kind of encompassing everything that we've talked about today. Who do you want to impact the most with the work that you do?
I've thought about this a lot recently, and I really want to impact the people that feel a little bit stuck. Maybe it's something physical, maybe it's mental, maybe it's emotional. Maybe they're not even quite sure, but they know that perhaps they're not meeting their full potential, that there's a bit of a blockage, because that really, to me, is like what breath work has done for me. It's like blown the lid off all of that stuff, and it like really helps you identify where are the things that are perhaps in your way. So the people that perhaps aren't meeting their full potential, maybe it is dysfunction or illness, maybe it's just knowing that they're not really at their 100% and they want to take those steps. They're proactive, they're motivated, they know that there's a better them that's out there. They just perhaps haven't found that yet. And working with those people, I think it gives me a lot of motivation, because you get to see this little light bulb go off and like, oh, this is how I can live my life. I feel better, and that helps me treat the people around me better. It's like this ripple effect of when you feel good every day, like you make the other people around you feel good, and vice versa. If you feel down in the dumps, like people notice that, like, and it affects those. So like optimizing your own present day experience is the best thing you can do for the people around you, and using these tools just to sort of understand a little bit more and work towards that 100% you.
Yes. Yeah. It's what I mentioned in your bio, that you believe that for everyone to get to a point where they're feeling better and breathing better, being at 100%, it's attainable. And the work that you're doing is helping us get there. So I appreciate that.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate this conversation. It's been a nice flowing, and I'm sure we can continue conversing for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome, Campbell. Thanks so much. Hope you have a great day.
Thanks, Dan. You too.